Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is exciting. So welcome, everybody, to this morning's CBI Cafe presentation. I'm going to introduce my father, who's going to introduce Ricky, who's going to introduce Laurie. Would anyone like to introduce me? Happy to invite welcome and introduce my father, Larry Fine, who represents the Adult Education Committee.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to see so many people here. I think that this is probably the largest number of people we've had for this season for the cafe. So on behalf of the Adult Ed Committee, which organizes the cafe, it's a great pleasure to welcome you and to welcome Ricky, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, and it's great to see everybody here. So it's going to be my pleasure to introduce Laurie Sanders, but I'm also going to say a little bit about Marcia Burek. Laurie agreed to do this talk without an honorarium, but asked that we dedicate the presentation in Marcia's memory. Marcia died in June 2022. She's been deeply, deeply missed by her many devoted friends. Over her lifetime, she consulted, taught, and traveled throughout the world and was active in politics and community service at the local level. Since her death, she's been honored by the Northampton Chamber of Commerce and acknowledged for her contributions to such organizations as Cooley Dickinson, Northampton Education Foundation, Northampton Survival Center, and Historic Northampton. She was a longtime and very active member here at CBI. As Cindy Langley said in her remarks for the Chamber of Commerce, Marcia was the consummate connector and relationship builder. She was a friend to many, and on a personal note, she was a friend to both my parents and to me. And as her obituary concludes, her memory will be a blessing and her acts of kindness and good deeds will live on in this community and around the world. I first met Laurie Sanders when she gave a version of this talk in 2016. I was so impressed with Laurie that I started to attend walks and talks led by her as part of her work at Historic Northampton. I thought I knew a lot about Northampton. I grew up here my whole life, but the more I participated in these events, the more I've learned. Laurie and I developed a friendship that became even more meaningful when we saw each other at the cemetery at Marcia's funeral and realized that we had shared Marcia as a dear friend. Laurie has been co-executive director of Historic Northampton since 2016. She's a local naturalist. A friend of mine from Ohio recently sent me a wildlife video that she saw on the internet taken in Northampton. I was not surprised to see that it was one of Laurie's many wildlife webcams that she has around the city. She's especially interested in the connections between the natural world and local history. There's a set of programs right now at Historic Northampton on that. And Laurie's the former host of Field Notes, a weekly natural history feature that aired on public radio for a decade. Okay, I am going to say a few words about Historic Northampton. Laurie did not ask me to do this, but I am very excited about Historic Northampton. I had my big birthday celebration there last year because I love it so much. It's a private nonprofit corporation. It's not directly funded by Northampton, which means that it depends on contributions and grants. Due to Laurie and co-executive director Betty Sharp's efforts, this organization is vibrant and has a lot to offer. There's an interesting exhibit now that's reopening called Making It on Main Street, if you haven't seen it. They've supported extensive research on indigenous populations and enslaved individuals in this area, which you can find on the website. And last year, they renovated an old decrepit barn and made it beautiful. And it is a fabulous event space that has theater and music and all kinds of gatherings. And I encourage you to check it out, and there's materials on the food table. Laurie.
Thank you, Ricky. I feel like in some ways I want to just go right to the Q&A, but is there a way to shut the overhead lights off? That would be wonderful. And if I stand here, can everyone see behind me? Mostly. So for those of you who know me, we're going to focus, because this is my audience, really about CBI, but how your land connects to the past. And as Ricky said, it's in honor of Marcia, who I met here thanks to Jacob, who first invited me to give this talk. This was a talk that I gave back originally in 2015, before I was working at Historic Northampton, but as a benefit for them. And then after I gave the talk, this woman rushed up to me, and it was Marcia Burek. And well, for those of you who knew Marcia, then there were just 1,000,001 threads that we had with one another. So I, like so many people, adored Marcia. Okay, so the okay. Let's see. Okay, so we're gonna focus on you. And so for some of you, this history, do you want to move? Are you gonna be able to see the presentation? Wait 1 second.
We're gonna have to lock everybody up.
Yeah, we can see behind.
Okay,
We just have to go like this.
oh, of course. All right. People get,
Thank you.
okay, fantastic. Barbara, it's so nice to see you.
You too. I feel like I have this private microphone system, it's a little crazy.
So I thought, for some of you, this is a little review in history, but for some, not so much. So just to have a sense, the synagogue, the Congregation B'nai Israel acquired this piece of property where we are right now in 1960. And as you can see in this slide, it says the council accepts the bid of $12,000, bid for the infirmary site. And behind that is a picture of the deed, the original deed. And then in 1961-ish, there's the image from the Gazette of breaking ground. Now, before the synagogue was here, the space that was used was this one, which is on Bridge Street, very close to historic Northampton. And for those of you who don't know where historic Northampton is, because it was quiet for many years, we're more or less right opposite of the post office, very close to Talbot's and the Baker's Pen, which I'm sure you all know. So this, in 1905, the congregation moved here. This had been St. John's Episcopal, and when they built their new building, they offered this space. And so this is where the congregation met for many years, and this is what that site looks like now. So let's just look at this amazing, okay, so Northampton has amazing history. But there are certain parts of the town where in 30 acres, the history is just extraordinary. And this is one of them. And it's such an amazing story to tell. So this is your site. This is what you own now. So that includes the water department building, the Lander Grinspoon, and your building, which you can see is sort of the white space. So but this is more or less when the Alms House property was acquired back in 1825, this yellow boundary is more or less what it was. Now, to orient you, that's the bike path, what we now call the bike path. And let's just go through sort of what's where. So this is now the Survival Center. That piece of property was cut off around 1895. It was still part of the Alms House, but then it was being used for the very early Department of Public Works, because they had been shifting from no longer needing stables to actually now using cars and structures. So to me, it's this like beautiful poetry that by sheer serendipity, the Survival Center relocated to that space. The city and the Survival Center had no idea of the history of that it was an Alms House property when that long-term rental was established. Over here is the Barrett Street Marsh Conservation Area, one of the oldest conservation areas in the city of Northampton, and sort of it was the way I started working and asking questions about this parcel. Here is the former water department building. This is the this narrow strip is the image, for those of you who saw the image in the announcement. This was the original Alms house. And that strip was cut off in 1894, and you're gonna see more about that. And then there's this little lavender parcel, which in 1895 became the Prospect Street School. And this is a photo of the kids from 1915. I was just talking with Rich Slozak. We have these two images, and one has a picture of John Coolidge, who might be Calvin Coolidge's son. So the reason I want to end with this is because, so this is kind of the overview. So when the congregation bought this, this is the plan that went with the purchase. So now I put the names on top, but where you are, the original Alms House lot, the water department, and the former Prospect Street School, and then the survival centers off but adjacent. So the thing that's interesting about sort of your connection to this site is that in 1955, this is a deed that the congregation received for the Prospect Street School parcel. And the terms when the city sold the congregation this parcel was that it was going to be building a synagogue or a Jewish community center on that lot, and then you had 5 years to do it. And one of the terms was that you had to knock down the Prospect Street School. And if it didn't work out that you were going to build there, you could sell it for single-family homes. So next time you drive down Prospect Street, look at the homes that are there along Hayes Avenue. So this was the lot. So in 1961, after acquiring this, CBI sells this lot, or 64. But when the congregation purchased the city infirmary, as it was then known, this is what it looked like. Pretty overgrown, pretty grubby. And so this was in its heyday. So this is a building that was built in 1891. And it had served from 1891 until right around 1935-ish as the Alms House. And so, but in 1927, there are new state rules that go in, and you're no longer going to be an Alms House caring for the poor. You're going to be infirmaries. That takes a little bit of time at this to move down here into Northampton. So it really continues functioning as a house for people who don't have means to live there. And here are some of the reasons that for those changes. So after the Great Depression in 1935, FDR puts in place a series of new infrastructure that helps with public assistance, aid to children, unemployment, social insurance, other special. So there's a shift from town farms, as they're sometimes called. City homes is another synonym. Alms House. Poor house is sort of a more vernacular, not what cities and towns call these structures. But that's sort of the time period where they go away. And so in Northampton, it goes from the Alms House to a city infirmary. And so now there's these questions. So the city infirmary is also serving people who don't have the means to go to Cooley Dickinson Hospital. And there's like 20 people here. After the Great Depression, the numbers go up. So they're not only in that 1891 building, but they're also in the original Alms House, which I'm going to show you some pictures of. That's sort of the overflow area. It's the bunkhouse for the men. And but it's pretty amazing if you look at some of the old records. In 1934, they're saying for the bigger building with the 2 wings, well, there's no electricity or lighting in the rooms where the people are sleeping, but like that's okay. They don't really need electricity or lighting or any kind of gas lights because, well, they read in the common room downstairs and then they go to bed early. And there is a light in the hallway. well, we shut it off, but anyway, I mean, just that notion, like, well, you know, that people don't need lighting in their rooms is kind of interesting. That's in 1934. So anyway, so now, so things are changing, people are beginning to say, okay, there's only a few people living at the infirmary. We think that those people could move over to special residence at Cooley Dickinson Hospital and be cared for. And then we could either make this former Alms House property a much bigger school, as you see here, the use of the infirmary site is for the school, but people oppose that. And in fact, the people who are opposing it is the Board of Public Welfare in Northampton. Then somebody else says, oh, I have a great idea. That could become a police station. And then a little bit later, the building gets really in bad shape. And so the mayor orders it to be boarded up. And then before the synagogue begins getting involved, or at least any newspaper is announced. So meantime, you own a piece of property just like right next door, right? The former Prospect Street School in 55 you acquire. And in 59, there's a proposal like, oh, the church, this Baptist church is going to buy it. But you know, in 1960, your community buys it. This is the original Alms House, and this is from Forbes Library. And it's unfortunate that there's as much lighting in the room as there is, but I think you'd be able to see that the windows are all, I guess they never got boarded up, but they did get smashed up. So just a little quick history on the history of thinking about the poor and who gets assistance. And so the earliest time really that people begin thinking about it is after the Black Death. And one of King Edward sets up these initial rules saying, you know, these people who are able-bodied and they're vagabonds and begging, we're not going to support them. We're only going to support the people who are truly worthy poor. This is the origin. And that 200 years later gets solidified in some new rules in England by Queen Elizabeth I. And it's this Act for Poor Relief. And these are the rules that in 1600 get passed. And this is when the English come to Massachusetts and settle in Northampton in 1654. These are the rules that migrate across the Atlantic and are really put in place here. So if you look in 1698, so Northampton is established by the English, settled by the English in 1654. By 1698, they're thinking, okay, we have people coming in, who are they? You know, at the legal town meeting, considering several persons and families in the town, which if they're not taken care of, so they followed some, you know, they followed some employment, they might need some assistance. So, and here's James Russell Trumbull, who lived not too far away, was the former editor of the Gazette, writing in 1898. And this is really a great quote. First, and perhaps worthy of the highest consideration, was the problem concerning the care of the town poor, an unsolved enigma that still vexes the statute books of more modern legislation. While ready and willing to supply the wants of the truly needy, you'll hear this over and over again, the people who are opposed to harboring the idle or vicious, no drone would be tolerated. Every person able to work was not only morally bound to earn a living, but if unwilling, was to be compelled to do so under the law. 1705, there's only a few hundred people living in Northampton, but this is when they decide to actually build a place for people to live who are truly needy. And they build it right in downtown Northampton, where we would say sort of between what's now the courthouse and First Churches in that area. So far we have no idea like what that building was like. Now we're going to jump forward another century, and Josiah Quincy and others, as more immigrants are coming to the area, they put out this new Quincy report, which really informs these next few years in Northampton and elsewhere. And again, it's just this able-bodied poor. Those are the folks that you're going to rent out to whoever will bid the highest, whether it's families or individuals. If they're able-bodied, they're going to go to a farm or somewhere else and work for their living. Or if they have their own home, you're going to supply them with some materials so that they are not a burden on the community. And finally, and lastly, is this provision to, if you're truly blind, unable to work, aged, they will build an alms house or a poor house, and that's where you can go. So this is in 1821 that he puts these out, and in Northampton, by 1825, things are in the works. So by 1820 in Northampton, the population has gone from just a few hundred a century ago to now about 3,000. And so they decide to buy for the Alms house, the farm of this guy named James Hurlbut. Now the Hurlbuts are people who are, if you look at some of the early maps of Northampton, the Hurlbuts were right in downtown Northampton. They owned what sort of is like the Hotel Northampton lot. But you see, if you look at old maps at Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuary, what we now, when we go, if you go there and you look out at that big marsh that was known as Hulbert's Pond for many years, you see a map image and then a photograph here. And then, but James Hulbert, so he owned this piece of property much up of Round Hill, all the way over sort of like opposite the quad. And he had a big apple orchard and he had a cider mill. And so, and some of that was hard cider. So he was a popular guy. He was also a musician and he made instruments. And so in addition, so after he sells this piece of property, he moves to what was then known as Lonetown. Anyone know where Lonetown is? That's what we now call West Farms. So Sylvester Road, what over near the Mineral Hills, between the Mineral Hills and the Sawmill Hills. So he moves over there, and in 1851, so that's like 20 years after he sells it, 30 years after he sells it, he's visited by Jenny Lind, who was basically the Taylor Swift of the 19th century, super famous. And she goes apparently over to his place and they play music and she has a great time. She's meantime staying for her honeymoon up on Round Hill. So, so in 1825, the town buys the Hulbert farm, and here's the piece: a building, also a building at the poorhouse, to be erected and completed as soon as possible. Okay, so note the date: April 4th, May 17th. The town having adopted the rules of the poorhouse, hereby cautions all persons, several children belonging to the establishment will be bound. There's already people living there in 1 month. So here's the thing that I just and then by 1827, a couple of years later, there are 52 people living at the poorhouse. So I think what has happened, I think what's happened is that the original building that the Hulberts lived in, they just add some wooden buildings, and that's really where people live. They don't erect a whole new house. They erect more like barn type buildings. So the other piece that I'm gonna weave in all these different little threads is that when that's happening, so is canal fever in America. And that begins right here in the Valley, in the sense that where we now call South Hadley Falls, between Northampton and South Hadley Falls was 2 acres, 2 miles of rapids. Now you can get a little glimpse of that if you go down to the fossil footprints, the dinosaur footprints off of Route 5. If you've walked down there on the sandstone beds, you can get a sense of the riffles. But so much of that is hidden from us now because of the Holyoke Dam has popped that water level up. But because of that 2 miles of rapids, it was impossible for people to take boats in that stretch of the Connecticut River. So you would get up to South Hadley Falls, you'd unload all your stuff, then you'd schlep it by oxen, then you'd put it back on another boat, and then you'd bring it to Northampton. So in 1792, a number of people here in Northampton thought, we have a great idea. We're gonna dig a 2-mile trench around those rapids, and it's the first public-private canal partnership in America. And it's wildly successful, huge economic boom, and it sparks canal fever across America. Like George Washington, he's thinking, we can have them here, we can have them there. And so, like going back, look at all the canals that are proposed or in place. Now, the one that really changes everything is the Erie Canal. And this, when Governor Clinton of New York suggests this, you can see what Thomas Jefferson thinks. What a dumb idea, right? But we all know that Clinton's ditch, or Clinton's folly, as it was called, is again like crazy successful. And so now suddenly everyone's thinking, wait a minute. And Northampton people are thinking, wait a minute. And New Haven people are thinking, we don't want to miss out on that economic possibility. So here's encircled is where you are in the Alms house in Northampton. And in 1822, they get one of the engineers from the Erie Canal to come over and help with the layout, which goes from Northampton to New Haven. He happens to be like the brother of the sister of the judge who lives now where Smith College's College Hall is. So there's some reasons that he comes to Northampton. But the canal construction, they lay it out in just a few years. The construction begins in 1828. By 1835, you can see some of the details on the width of it. And it opens to huge fanfare in 1835. And it is a dismal failure. They don't have enough water. The farmers are mad because their cows don't want to cross it. And people lose loads of money. And lots of people in Northampton lose a lot of money. And their timing is terrible because the day basically that they are digging that first shovelful in 1828, the railroad is already in Worcester. And so by 1845, the railroad is in Northampton. So the canal, which is always suffering. And then the other thing to think about is that the canal is frozen for big chunks of time. So, so in 1845, the railroad gets here, and then these other pieces that are happening, right? By this point, Northampton in 1845 is really becoming a manufacturing center. The Mill River, which we just sail right across now and hardly pay any attention to, has 40 factories along it. We are an economic center here, and the population is reflecting that, just as it is with the industrialization of America all over. So look at the population changes from 3,000, okay, it's about 1,000 more, and then you can see how it's doubling and increasing. And so as more people come to America, it's a time in America where there's all these social movements and reforms, and you can just think about them. There's religion, there's education, there's abolition, there's women's suffrage, and there's also this whole emphasis on, okay, how do we care for the mentally ill, and how do we care for the poor? All these questions are coming together. And so in the center of this is Dorothea Dix, and she is an advocate for mental health. And so she and others operating here, that's one of the reasons why Northampton becomes the second site in the Commonwealth to build what was then called an insane asylum. And then, so many times people who were living in the Alms houses had mental health troubles. So now they move to one type of facility, and the Alms houses have a slightly different role. The other piece that's happening is that at this property, there's a master and a matron or a keeper, and they are overseeing a farm that's on this property. So the building is between us and the water department company and a water department building. And then there's some wooden structures off the back. There's a couple of stables. They've got their agriculture nearby, their farms nearby, and behind us beyond the bike path is a big pasture. And so this is the area that but although Josiah Quincy, when he puts out those rules, he says, okay, well, we're gonna have poorhouses, but we're gonna have the state and other people coming in and making sure that these people are cared for and that the conditions are good. But you can see, okay, in 1854, there's no water supply aside from wells in Northampton. And this is just a tragic, there's sickness and death have visited the county poorhouse in a fearful manner. The wife of the steward and about 25 of the paupers have died, and a dozen remain in the hospital of the institution. Those who have not been attacked with disease have left the place. And then Mr. Weitzel was attacked by cholera, but he recovered. So these are grim conditions. Except for, here's our town report from 1858. So Northampton becomes a city in 1883. So the poor are kept comfortably, but not extravagantly. The town ought never regret expending money necessary to make them comfortable in their last days. So these are really, these are convalescent homes in a sense. And then a couple of years later, no plan to assist people who have friends or kin, right? So if you have friends or kin, you're supposed to live with them. But we do not think it right to oblige our worthy poor to go to the poorhouse for assistance when we can get them supported among their friends cheaper. There's a degradation in going to a poorhouse, which this class of poor shrink from. There's a subsequent report that says that Northampton is spending some of the least amount of money per person. Okay, another really important piece in the history of this property and the history of this institution is that in 1867, the rail line that goes from the Stop and Shop area off of King Street now to Williamsburg, now what we call the bike path, is installed. And the problem is that let's see, here's the picture. This is the little dog leg that we're talking about, and it's instigated by a guy named Joseph Haydenville. He's one of the primary manufacturers, and he suggests that if we have this railroad line, which not only takes freight and products, but also passengers, it will be another economic boon to the manufacturing that's happening up in Haydenville. The problem for the poor farm is that it takes the 4 or 5 best acres of land for growing vegetables. Now, the other thing that's happening is that when the railroad goes through here, it changes the way the water patterns work. So right now, where we are here, there's water coming off of Childs Park as well as Round Hill. And so when the railroad goes in, it starts blocking things up. And this brook initially goes down along King Street and through downtown Northampton. And already it's in pretty grim conditions, but because of now the blocking by the railroad, there's more flooding. And so people are just beginning to think of the first sewers, because you got to remember there's just so many horses, right? And there's just managing waste is a super challenge at this point. So King Street Brook is getting bigger. There's lots of flooding in downtown. Another important, really important piece is that in 1867 and 1870, there are three major fires in downtown Northampton. And so although there's been talk about having a water supply, public water supply installed, this is what it drives the impetus. It's not pure water for domestic use. The fundamental underlying reason for installing a water supply in Northampton is fire suppression. It's 100% of the reason. And it just coincides with the timing in America where the railroads are here. We also have the capacity to build the pipes and extend the pipes so that the fires happened in 1870. Talk about a public works project. In 1871, they have figured out the route and they install the first water supply. And in 1871, they have this party in downtown Northampton because the head where the first reservoir is, there's a 240 feet drop. So when they open that fire hydrant in downtown, there is like 1,000 people there and the water shoots up more than 100 feet and everyone is whooping it up. The problem is, or the good thing is, now people have clean drinking water. And guess what? If you have a lot more water available, what do? You use it. But there's not a sewer system. So there's a lot more water in downtown. And so that water's in downtown. The water from this area is draining into downtown and people are going crazy because it's festering. It's just really disgusting. So some of their first rules are like, we have an idea, let's bury it. And they start piping some of these streams. But here in 1871, they have a new, better idea. They think, wait a minute, we're going to just take King Street Brook and we're going to divert it. We're not going to have it go into downtown. We're going to have it go the other direction. Now, this is super challenging because it's about a half a mile and the drop is about, well, it's kind of like the curvature of the earth, right? There's not much drop. So there's a tremendous opportunity for it to back up. But they're thinking about it. Okay, so 2 years later, there's the panic. Here's the town report. Wandering pests who go about, so a panic is a severe depression, economic depression, who go about from town to town causing a nuisance, which no legislation has as yet been to overcome, has been designed. I think I missed a word there. Anyway, you get the point that there's this whole history in Northampton and many other places of strangers coming in, and if they're not living with relatives, they get warned out. And that's, you can see this sort of nativism and coming through. Okay, back to King Street Brook. This is, if you look at these town reports, which are like a treasure trove of information, you know, this is the part, okay, the water supply went through in 2 years, but these other problems of solving are really challenging. So in 1878, so 10 years later, nothing's happened and people are still, you know, in our opinion, the line of the King Street Brook should be attended to. That part of it, which is between the Connecticut River Railroad track and Park Street, is clearly a great nuisance and source of sickness. This is, you know, before people really understand what germ theory. Okay, around the same time, there's this new group called the State Board of Health, Lunacy, and Charity, and their job is to review all of the mental health institutions as well as the poorhouses. And some of you will remember from your history books what happens in Tewksbury in 1883. It's a visit to that facility and it's condemned. The conditions are absolutely atrocious. And so it sparks a statewide review of all the almshouses, including the one in Northampton. And here is the Hampshire Gazette. Vermin of the creeping sort have free range. Prying off some of the plaster in one of the rooms, I found the bugs to be as thick as they well could make themselves. One amusement of the paupers is to lie abed and kill bugs on the walls. The bedding is filthy and the condition of things disgusting. It's disgraceful. And then, same year, different paper. While it's true that the place has for a few months been overrun with vermin, there has been no complaint of ill treatment. And it's been a place of prostitution, but only for a portion of the year. By 1891, the conditions are so terrible that the city decides, okay, we have to do something. And again, so the people are living, the matron and master, the steward, are living in the main house, and the people are living in these falling down wooden structures. And there's a men's wing and there's a woman's wing. There's a place out back, which is a pest house, when people have smallpox or tuberculosis or something like that. So in 1891, they decide to build that building that I showed you at the beginning. This building, a main building with two wings, one side for men, one side for women. At the same time, they decide to sell off some lots. They plan to sell off the original Alms house. They build the school. This is another group of kids. And in 1894, the first time they tried to sell the old Alms house as a lot, nobody's interested. But in 1894, William Gray buys a lot. And so this photograph, which is on the CBI website, which it turns out, I kept writing, Jacob showed it to me a few years ago. Where did you get that? That's fantastic. And we have it in our collection at Historic Northampton. But so this photograph, this I think, this is the original quote unquote Alms house, but I think really what the Alms house is the wooden structures in the back. I think this is James Hurlbut's original farmhouse that was sold, right? Because how could you have a poorhouse and then in like 5 weeks have a structure like that, right? So this is what's called a House Brothers photograph. They were itinerant photographers from Ashfield, and you would have your family portrait. It was very formal in front of your home. And this is beautiful because here's the woman and her 2 boys, a little baby, and the girl holding a kitty cat. And that's a whole other, like the history of pets is a whole other thing. But in the background, you can see the men's bunkhouse. All right, so but these people own like now a strip 100 by 200. Gray buys it in 1894 and he sells it in 1904 to Carlos Daniels. And Carlos and his wife Florence, who you can see here in a different House Brothers photograph. Now you can see the asylum, the Alms house in the back, the new wing, and they live here for the next more or less 30 years. But this is the part that I feel is the new piece of information, which is just so meaningful to me, and I hope to all of you, because so you see here he is, and the little family. There's actually 3 children there next to his wife. But in 1917, she dies. And in 2023, Carlos begins to have some financial troubles. So he mortgages the property. And then in 1925, he mortgages it again. And in 27, he mortgages it again. And in 1932, he loses the property. It's foreclosed upon. And the city of Northampton's water department buys the lot. And over the next few years, they allow this house, which is now known as the Daniels house, to be used as the spillover bunkhouse for men when the main building has too many people in it. 'Cause But I love that, so as part of that is that the property is, the Alms house is still trying to grow a little bit of food here, even though they don't have this other strip. So this is what Jacob and I we first met now 8 years ago, where I loved learning about this quote: "The farm is mainly a sand heap and will hardly raise white beans. Our town farm is a farm only in name, as its sandy soil makes no promises to a farmer. It can only furnish a healthy sunning spot for those who are beyond the cure of a sunbath." And then the east side is strong, wet land. That's the Barrett Street Marsh, and needs draining, which can be done at moderate cost, and afterwards produce 3 tons of hay to the acre. The west side is light, sandy soil where, with the proper treatment, a good garden could be had. And that's what you've got. That's what you've created. And I especially love that where you have created that is on the land that Carlos Daniels lost, but now your farm is sustaining families, just like the survival center. I just think it's just an extraordinary circle. Okay, but why is there sand? You knew I would come to Glacial Lake Hitchcock. So this is what it would look like 12,000 years ago. I promised you 12,000 years ago. Okay, this is the lake, and Northampton is outlined in black. As the Mill River was coming in, it's traveling, it's bringing huge amounts of sediment, and it's kind of an outwash plain like this. It creates big outwash plain. It creates the lake level drops. There's another big sandy delta outwash plain. You can see there's the Barrett Street Marsh in bright green, CBI in red, Round Hill and Childs Park are isolated. And so you are surrounded by sand on top of the sandy delta, on top of the Glacial Lake Hitchcock clays. And you are right on that edge. You're right on the beach. Thank you very much. So this is what happens. You have got those sandy delta. So the rain comes down, it goes right through the sand grains. It hits the Glacial Lake Hitchcock clays, which are basically impervious, and then it emerges as a wetland. Guess where we are, guys? We're right here on the sand. We go across the bike path. Let's do that. Okay, here's the sandy lot at the water department, former, now yours. Super sandy. If we go across the bike path, here's an old drainage that was installed during that era of the city infirmary and so-called poor farm. If you look where that arrow is, those are Glacial Lake Hitchcock clays. And it's one of the reasons that with the flooding, right over there, you are on the Glacial Lake bottom when you go over to the Barrett Street Marsh. So finally in 1905, the city decides after 30 years of crabbing about the flooding problems, they decide to dig this ditch and try to get the water to go into the Connecticut River. So there's where we are. And here's the water supply. And this is where so instead of going into the downtown area, now they totally divert it, and it goes here. And they take advantage of some of the old canal in order to do that. So what does it look like? So here you see where you are in red. And then that's what it looked like back in the 50s. So it was still being maintained as a pasture, but you can see the drainage ditch there going through the center. And that's now the new King Street Brook heading in the other direction. And you can see now, you can see some of those, I hope, little side details of people trying to drain it. This shows it again, where you can see some of those early drainage ditches. But one of the things that happens is, as I told you, the grade is so shallow. It's less than 2.5 feet drop in more than 2,000 feet. So it's a lake bottom. So shallow grade there's the underlying clays, and then the DPW, which is now the owner of that, is supposed to maintain it, but they're short-staffed, they don't do it. Then Bear Street goes in, that creates another blockage, so there's more water blocking up. There's the sewer line that gets installed near there. Also, the culverts are undersized. It's got a lot of problems. There's filling, there's a lot of sediment that's coming in from Round Hill and all of this Prospect Street area. More development, more stormwater, and then the Wetlands Protection Act is the grand finale, so that there's no longer going to be maintenance of those drainage ditches. And so what happens is, although it's maintained in the 70s, still some areas for hay, and you can still see evidence of old fencing down there if you poke around. It really becomes this important storage area for stormwater, but it also becomes this rejuvenated wetland. What it had been probably back in the 1700s, and before the Poor Farm came here and did some of that drainage work and ditching, so that in 1975, there's a petition that that land not be overseen by the Department of Public Works, but by a relatively new entity in Northampton called the Northampton Conservation Commission. And that same year, two people, a woman named Willow Zahowski, who grew up on Columbus Avenue, and that other person there with her, who happens to be my husband, petitioned the city to make it actually a conservation area. And Fred Morrison, who's my husband, he had been taking students from Jackson Street School down to the wetland. Remember, this is the 70s. There's all kinds of environmental happenings and a new awareness and appreciation of the natural world. There's a first plan in the city of Northampton for protection. And in 1975, the 25 acres becomes the third conservation area in the city of Northampton. And just as a follow-up, so Willow Zahowski, she eventually moves to Costa Rica, not too much longer, and she is one of the founders of something called the Monteverde Conservation League, which goes on to protect tens of thousands of acres, including the Children's Eternal Rainforest. She's also the author of this book, but she cites, when she looks at all the land that she's helped protect in Costa Rica, she says that it's really that first 25 acres that made such a difference in making her realize what was possible. Okay, we're almost at the end. In 63, so that railroad, that's now the bike path, until 1963, there's no, but by 29, there's no one traveling, there's no passengers. But until 63, the VA was coal-fired. And so the trains kept going to deliver coal to the Veterans Administration. And in 63, they stopped. And so this is the last train going across. And for 20 years, the railroad line is abandoned. And in 1975, the same year that the land is transferred and becomes conservation land, people start talking about this. Really, it was then a super new idea called a bike path. And so in 1983, the rail line, long abandoned, is converted to one of the first bike paths in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Off that bike path, you have this great view of the Barrett Street Marsh. Now you know the former pasture of the Alms house, which has really become a rejuvenated wetland and a green oasis within the city of Northampton. And here you can see some images of it as it changes over time. And it's just, here it is surrounded by development, but it's an extraordinary area for really a pretty high plant diversity. There are invasives, but great for insects. And in terms of that open wetland, there's multiple types of amphibians that you can find there. In addition to these, both also gray tree frog and wood frogs. And then it's a really important site for birds. And a few years ago, some of you may remember, in 2005, beavers established at the Barrett Street Marsh. And in 2006, they were removed. But a few years ago, the students at the Jackson Street School, I said, well, you know, I have some wildlife cameras. Do you have any questions? And they had been going down to the Barrett Street Marsh, and they said, are there any beavers there? And so I said, well, how can we find out? So I set up some wildlife cameras, and it's just an unbelievable amount of wildlife that you can see at the Barrett Street Marsh. I wrote a piece back in 1993 about just how amazing that place is. And I said things like, oh, it's this wonderful little spot for ducks, but you can never see deer or bear or bobcat there. I'm really glad I didn't bet a lot of money, because all of those species are there, plus coyotes, and just some, I mean, passing through, and just, it's been, I've had 2 cameras there for on and off for the last 3 years. So what I would like to propose is that back in the 90s, those of you who have seen this talk before, I'm still on the same soapbox, but this wooden path was installed. It wasn't installed in the right place. And now 20, 30 years later, it's really decrepit. And it doesn't feel physically, you don't feel physically safe there. So this is more or less where it is. Here's where you are. And there's the trail going down, and then a little trail before. I think it would be just fantastic for the city to create a boardwalk, a fully accessible boardwalk that would come off the bike path, give people a terrific view. You could have some awesome history of the site. And for Lander Grinspoon, it could also be just this, again, like a real wonderful resource for Jackson Street School, Lander Grinspoon, Campus School. Anyway, I hope that's in the future of this property. And I think it would make it safer for everyone who wants to visit, and just a terrific resource. So thank you all so much for your interest. And then I also want to call out, because last week, I think she's on the Zoom, but last week was Panina Glazer's birthday, and a couple weeks before it was Ricky's birthday. So thank you all so much. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And I will say, the people on the Zoom had the full color effect. It's hard with it being so light here. But anyway, hard questions, easy questions. You want to get another cup of coffee? Want to enjoy one of the 2 days with blue sky we've had in the last 2 weeks?
How did the flooding of the Mill River at various times play into the rest of the story about the Barrett Street Marsh?
The Mill River actually, well, the glacial Mill River affected the superficial geology here. The Mill River today is in a separate drainage. This is a tiny little watershed that includes Round Hill, Childs Park, and this little zone, and now it all drains to the Connecticut River.
So, I think in 1999 with Hurricane Lloyd, there was flooding on the street looking at Stop Shop, the street is on the left-hand side. Is it
Fair.
Church?
Barrett Street or Church?
Church.
Impressive.
My understanding was that that was a result of the fire station being built very near,
Okay, that Carlin Drive development, which is near the fire station. So the DPW has spent more money on the Barrett Street Marsh than any other 25-acre parcel in Northampton. And there have been so many, so the question for those of you who are on Zoom was about flooding in 1999 and the role of the newly constructed fire station. But that, because the gradient is so shallow, because there's so many obstacles in the way as that water goes through. And that whole property there, Carlin Drive, there was a series of court cases where the owners said it's because of the lack of maintenance that the city was required to do that our property has become wetter and wetter and wetter. And so they were successful in their court case. And so that's why that Carlin Drive development was allowed, and it enabled the fire station to also go in that area. The fire station is actually a little higher up, but there are some stormwater detention basins in both of those sites. But it's a tight site with a long history of manipulation. The other piece, in addition to the canal going through and kind of the backside of that, after the canal was defunct and that gets filled in, then there was a whole other rail line, which we don't see. It's where the Ford dealership is, and it kind of ran behind. And that all that yard, the big Stop and Shop, formerly Bradley's, for those of you who are going back, that was a giant railroad yard. And the other railroad company owned the other side of the street, which is that what had been Leah Toyota for years, and then now is that sort of vacant giant parking lot, because there's contaminants there from the old rail yard. Anyway, I'm not exactly answering your question, but I don't think that was really the cause of it. But there was just a lot of water and a lot of backing up. And so it's when those beavers arrived in 2005, there were at least 8, and which is an amazing story in itself, because they're coming from the Connecticut River. They're going basically 2,000 feet up pipes. So they're going in the darkness, under Route 91, under Route 5, under CVS, and then eventually emerging behind the apartments there. Anyway, that's a digression, but it's why the DPW was so alarmed, because that water level popped up by 4 feet when the beavers were there, and there was such a long history of flooding challenges in that area. Okay, 2 more questions and then we'll call it a day. Oh, 3 more questions. And then I'll be here.
I don't know much about sort of the indigenous people who lived here before, but I do understand that the Connecticut River Delta area, especially where the Oxbow is incredibly fertile. That was a really fertile area for the folks who were here before us. And I would find it incredibly interesting to, I know you only had your hour and a half or whatever, but to have more of a panel with maybe someone who also understood sort of the indigenous peoples, sort of the same way you're talking about our land, just also in that area. I don't know how much you already know about it, or if there's a lot to know more.
I think this area Okay, I'm sorry. So the question was, what do we know about how indigenous people might have used this land or in this area? And so we do know some things about, I would say, sort of the downtown area. If you look at the 1831 map, which is available on Historic Northampton's website and other locations too, one of the pieces that's really informing in terms of land use practices by Native people are the use of the different names. So for instance, where there is St. Mary's Cemetery, that whole area is called the Millstone Mountain Plain, or you see Filer's Plain. And the word plain for the English meant open lands in the uplands. If you have other areas that were called meadows, those were open lands near larger streams and rivers. I love that because from that, we know that the Native people were burning and keeping those areas open. That's the only way that that happens. So it's a different conversation. There were some areas where we know people were living. This is not one of them, but for sure, this is an area that you could, very easily, it's a nice gradient, right? And if you're going from here to the Mill River, I'm sure people pass through. Did they live here, reside here? I would say probably not, based on what we know.
You can say something about the exhibit that's at downtown that you have right now around Indigenous history.
No, because we don't have.
Oh, I thought you said that it was.
We have some information on our website. Jacob is just asking, we have some information on our website about the enslaved people and the indigenous people. So, okay, two more, and then I'm gonna let you go.
Two facts on the question. One thing I found that the Mill River was very low a few years ago when I read this in college from Wagner, and one of them had named the continent on the site. And I made it to within 2 years. And it was one of those years where there was flooding in the river, so people died. So this was probably but I didn't know if there was more interesting to say about that. Second thing is, I met someone down there last summer who told me that apparently there's a group of people who like to do this bathing in the middle of the marsh there where it's kind of private. I was wondering if you ever heard of it.
I don't have a camera there. Yeah, I'll repeat. So.
I was wondering about that for love, which I personally love, and I will show that after here. Is it redeemable? Is it fixable, or is it?
Okay, so there were three questions. One is about the Mill River disaster in 1874, which I'm going to just kind of punt and say this is the 150th anniversary to commemorate that flood, which was in 1874 the largest man-made flood disaster in the nation's history. And Historic Northampton, working with Leeds Civic Association and folks in Williamsburg, we're planning this amazing week plus of events that will begin up in Williamsburg with a commemoration. 139 people lost their lives in 1 hour. And there will be a rider, just as there was in 1874, who'll be riding down through the town. There will be some commemorative tree planting. Ultimately, over the 5 years, 139 trees to recognize all the people who lost their lives. But the other piece that's relevant, and we'll be sending out more information soon, is that we're going to be able to, Betty Sharp, who's the other co-director who wrote the book In the Shadow of the Dam, she's developed a drama, a reader's theater, which takes quotes from the coroner's inquest, which began just a week after. And so we're working with the courts, and we're going to be able to hold that inquest in the historic courthouse. And it's an awesome venue. It's not the same courthouse, but anyway, so those are coming, and absolutely, there was just tremendous destruction, so that's the source of your clay. The nudist bathing, I don't know about. And the boardwalk, the problem was that boardwalk that's going into the marsh was installed in the wrong location the first time, and it's not high enough. So I think it could become part of something else, but one of the problems is when you're there, you're just looking out, and really what we all want, and in terms of accessibility, I think accessibility is something that we all really care about and become much more aware of, and it's not accessible. And I think a new boardwalk could become fully accessible, broader, and just be a much safer, more interesting, valuable resource to the community. So, okay, I'm only gonna let one more question happen. Yeah, one last.
No, I don't have it.
Yeah.
Is there one
There
more
was
question?
one over here.
What can we do to help make that boardwalk happen?
Come talk to me afterwards. We'll figure out a coalition. I think, I've mentioned it to the city already, but I'd love to.
Please join me in expressing tremendous
Thank you.
gratitude.
Say three quick things. One, it just feels like such an incredible gift to have someone who, I mean, I feel like you're part of our community, but to have someone who, not a member of this community, to be able to come in as a friend and share so much about this land that we feel so connected to, it matters so much to us, that we're now the stewards of. So it just adds so much.
I have, like, the reassembling by the community of so much of the land, and it's just a fantastic story,
Yeah.
what you've done. It's.
And we wouldn't know it, but the point is, we wouldn't know it if you didn't do this incredible sleuthing, and then the way in which you share it. So we're so grateful. It's such a gift, and hopefully, building on that, the second point was, I just feel so perfect and beautiful that that this is in honor of Marcia, and it just strikes me, as I'm sure it strikes many people, that beyond the fact that the two of you got to know one another and build this friendship in her last years, that you share a lot in common, and that one of them is just your shared love for the city of Northampton. Marcia dedicated so much of her life to Northampton. I think it was infectious, and she helped other people love Northampton more and feel a sense of pride, civic pride, and you do the same. You're helping all of us feel more pride and sense of history, which, again, is, I think, part of the gift that Marcia gave. So I just love that connection. And then lastly, just a lot of gratitude to the Adult Education Committee, who's been doing such tremendous work this year, and Panina, who is out of town. So that's why she's not here, but is really helping to lead the charge. So thanks to the Adult Education Committee, who's bringing such high quality programming, and hopefully that'll continue. So thanks to everybody.